Hi, my name is Angela Chavez, the Communications Director at Courage, California, and I'm calling to conduct a poll about the upcoming primary elections. Would you be willing to answer a few questions? Did I lose you as soon as I mentioned polling? Come back to me. I'm kidding. You're in the right place. You're listening to Courage. It looks good on you. And you guessed it. Today we're talking about polling. Remember that one time in 2016 when the polls overwhelmingly got the presidential election wrong? And pollsters spent the next few months attempting to make sense of how the polls were so wrong. And most Americans questioned if polls could even be trusted. You may not pay too much attention to polling until an election rolls around, but folks like me who eat, breathe, and sleep campaigns can never have enough access to polling. Today, we're going to talk about how polling is conducted, its limitations, and despite its limitations, why it remains such a critical tool to progressive campaigns. So stick around, because there is an election right around the corner, and you're going to want to know how to make sense of all the polling results that will soon make headlines. Before I pass the mic over to our guest today, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our presence on the traditional and unceded territory of hundreds of First Nations who are the traditional caretakers of the land that we call California.
Thank you, Angela. And hello, everyone. I'm Jay Chotirmal, Courage California's Senior Communications and Voter Engagement Manager. In this episode, we'll talk about polling, what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us, who it includes and who it doesn't include, and how information inclusion matter to get policies and leaders who truly represent all of us. We'll also cover Courage California's polling work that we are doing in partnership with Data for Social Good, Communities for a New California, Inland Empire United, and Orange County Civic Engagement Table, as well as speak to the power of polling with representation at the center. I'm excited to be joined by Lisa Garcia Bedolla for Data for Social Good, and in a few minutes we'll also be joined by Jose Luis Bedolla, also with Data for Social Good. Lisa is also UC Berkeley's Vice Provost for Graduate Studies and Dean of the Graduate Division, a professor in the Graduate School of Education, founder of the Center of Democracy and Organizing, one of the nation's top experts on political engagement within communities of color, and a Courage California Institute board member. Hello, Professor Garcia Bedolla. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Jay, for having me.
I'll admit I'm a little nervous after reading your long list of job titles, but that's why we invited you here with us today. So, as you know, polling is everywhere and is referenced all the time in news coverage. And the type of polls are endless. We have presidential approval ratings, election exit polls, support or opposition to a policy, and that's just to name a few types. To kick off our conversation, I want to unpack the idea that not all polls are created equal. There's a tendency for people and media to see polling numbers and assume that information presented is neutral, objective, and reliable, but that's not the case at all. If you're an avid news reader, such as myself, you might have seen a lot of reporting on crime and criminal justice policies in California over the past few months. There's one poll in particular that has a lot of people in California and nationwide talking the past few weeks, which was referenced and essentially made the title of a San Francisco Chronicle piece. The title was DH Issa Boudin recall, new poll of SF voters suggests he might be in trouble. The poll was conducted by the campaign seeking to recall DA Boudin. Of the 800 likely primary voters they polled, 68% said they would vote yes on recalling Boudin. Professor Garcia Bedolla, we learned from our partners that this was a push poll. Could you tell us what a push poll is and if these polls are reliable or just another form of politics?
So when you say push poll, I'm assuming you mean a poll that was conducted for a particular purpose or for a particular answer, which is something that happens quite commonly. And so as you mentioned, as polling has become easier, and as the tools of polling have become more readily available to more people, you have more people conducting polls. And so the most important thing to first ask yourself or to find out when you see a poll in the Chronicle or anywhere else is who conducted it. And is it an academic organization? Is it an independent think tank? Because those are places like the Brookings Institution or the Public Policy Institute of California. These are organizations that historically have done a lot of polling and who have committed in terms of their mission not to put their thumb on the scale, that they make every attempt, appreciating all polls have biases in particular directions, not to push for a particular outcome. If the poll is run by a political organization or an organization that advocates for a particular point of view, then it's important to look carefully at who was asked the questions. So how big was the sample? How was the sample derived? In other words, where did they get people's information? How did they find people? So if you found a bunch of people on Facebook that happen to like a certain thing, that's probably not a very good poll, because you're self-selecting a set of people who you know already believe something that is relevant to the question you're asking, right? So who's asking? Who are they asking? For people of color, it's especially important to know how many people got asked, because in general, lower income people, folks of color, immigrants are less likely to answer a poll, period. And so you have to be very mindful of that when conducting a poll. So if you have a poll of 500 people and 10% of your population you know is folks of color, that in the poll, it'll probably only be about 5%. And then you're talking about a very small number of people speaking for a very large group of people. And every time you have that, you're going to have a lot more error. And you're going to have some distortions, right, of what people actually think. So who's giving the poll? Who are they asking? And then how are they asking? And so any reputable polling organization, when you read that article in the Chronicle and they give you a link to the actual report that the article is based upon, the end of that report is where nerds go. But that end should include, even if you don't decide to look at it, you should see the questionnaire. So you have to know how the questions were asked, because obviously how you ask somebody a question can drive how they answer. This is especially true for questions like affirmative action or questions about abortion or things that are very politically fraught. How you phrase it and what information you provide to voters within the question really does matter. And then how it's analyzed, right? So the methodology, like how did they do weighting? In other words, how did they adjust the poll after the fact to represent the population that they wanted to represent? And then how are they interpreting the information? And so there's a tendency to see that final number of 68% of people said that they're going to will it be willing to recall a particular person? But there's a lot of decision making that comes before you've gotten to that number that really drives whether or not that number is real or something that's just a product of what the pollster wanted in terms of outcomes.
I have a quick follow-up. So polls like this, which you mentioned are made for a particular purpose, would you argue they are conducted to influence voter behavior? And what does that mean to an organization like Courage that's focused on getting folks out to the polls? You know, getting as many people to show up so that we have a government that is truly representative of the people it serves.
Absolutely. Polls can influence reality. This is why people who are reputable pollsters really try to think about timing of when polls are released. They try to think about how they present the information that is found in polls. If you think about in a typical presidential race, the nature of the race often can be driven by polls saying what people think about X candidate or Y candidate. And that becomes then part of the political narrative and becomes part of the actual campaign. And so these data points get inserted into the political process at different points in time. That's important for organizations like Courage because the people that Courage wants to activate, the people that Courage wants to bring into the political process tend to not be the people who are asked questions on polls.
Yeah.
So if you have a poll that says that they're polling likely voters, which is very common in polling, in California, but likely voters are much more white and much older than the electorate. And so you're going to get a distorted image of what quote unquote voters think, because voters actually includes, that term should include everyone who's eligible to vote, but those are not the people who are necessarily answering the polls. And so it becomes self-fulfilling that you've asked a subset of people that actually don't represent the population what they think about X, Y, or Z. They tell you, and you think, well, that's what's politically possible. Whereas if you had a poll that actually talk to a broader swath of the population, you may be able to see that, you know what, people over 60 think this about this policy, let's say free college. People who are 18 to 30 feel really differently. And so then in fact, this is an issue that's in contention, right? Or that's not everyone is in agreement, rather than thinking that, oh, everyone thinks that this is not a viable option. And
Yeah.
so that's why it's so important to make sure that your polls include everyone, so that it doesn't end up with this self-fulfilling idea about what kinds of policies people are willing to support politically based on the small number of people who are voting now.
Thank you, Professor. Can you unpack a little more this idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy coming from only polling voters or likely voters?
And so this has a negative consequence on a number of levels, right? On the first, most basic level is that you have cumulative disadvantage in terms of voice, right? So if you're a voter, you have voice at the ballot box, and guess what? You also have voice in polls. If you're a non-voter, you don't have voice in either space. So essentially, you're a member of the polity, but your voice is not heard. On the second level, what it means is that then campaign consultants and politicians look at the issues that people say matter to them, and they structure their campaign around those issues. But perhaps those aren't the issues that in fact matter to the non-voter, right? Or the person that's disengaged. And so that person's never going to feel invited into the process, because the people who are running campaigns aren't talking about the things that they actually care about, because again, they have no voice. And so this is another self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that the people who currently have voice are the ones then whose issues get taken up in the political process. But that means the issues that the people who are feeling separate from the process really care about aren't necessarily brought in. And so they don't get activated, and they don't feel like the political process cares about the things that matter to them day to day.
So why don't we see more groups that have ties to communities that haven't been active voters conduct polling? Like, what are the type of resources that it takes to actually do this type of work?
So it's resources defined in different kinds of ways and at multiple levels. So the first set of resources is just expertise. And part of the problem is that the people who are trained in survey research in the political realm, by and large in the United States, currently within institutions of higher education, are not necessarily trained to think about minoritized groups as part of the polling process in a meaningful way. And so on the most basic level, the training is not culturally competent in the sense of making certain that polls are able to address the needs of those non-voting, folks that don't have voice, right? So number one is it's just a problem with the field. And then secondarily, you do need that expertise in order to put the poll together, and you need resources in terms of being able to access a list of individuals, which is much more expensive if you're going beyond the voter file, because then you have to buy phone numbers or other forms of contact from third parties. You have to, be able to hire people who can put the questionnaires together. And again, there are very few people who can do that in a way that's really mindful of these differences in polling different kinds of populations. If you really want to be inclusive, you then have to translate, you have to come up with a questionnaire that's high quality, and then you have to translate it ideally into multiple languages, which is of course expensive and also an art, not a science. It's actually quite difficult to translate meaning. Often what we do is we translate word for word, but that doesn't necessarily impart appropriate meaning in a different language. And then you have to have someone available to conduct the poll and then analyze and interpret the results. And all of that takes a great deal of time. It takes expertise, it takes resources. And so for most community-based organizations that are interested in learning more about what their community thinks, it's just too expensive, time-consuming, and beyond their particular capacities in terms of skill sets to be able to take on high-quality polling.
Thank you, Professor. That's a great segue for us to talk through the current polling projects we've been working on together. Courage has been partnering with you, Data for Social Good, and Communities for a New California, Inland Empire United, and Orange County Civic Engagement Table to poll young people around the state in key congressional districts such as the Central Valley and Orange County. Jose Luis, can you speak to the current polling projects we've been conducting and how they fill some of the polling gaps that are currently out in the field?
Yeah, so as Lisa mentioned, what we're trying to do is we're attempting to reach out to the people that are very difficult to get, maybe not exactly part of the normal process, still voters, still registered to vote, even if they're not, your blue chip, A1, whatever you want to call it, high grade voters. And that's the point. We're trying to get to the people that, who have a voice, but maybe not have not been asked before, about their opinions and certain things. In fact, half of the time, some of the comments that we get for the Central Valley and in Orange County and different localities is, why are you calling, this is strange. This is who are you kind of a thing. So we get a lot of that kind of initial skepticism, which is, strange. And again, if you haven't been talked to ever or in a long time, of course, you're going to look at it and say, this is a little strange. So we've been able to reach out to that difficult cohort, difficult to find, difficult to get set of folks. And when we get them engaged and we start talking to them, especially in focus group environments and young people and people who have not been talked to on a regular basis, they look at it and say, yeah, wow, this is great, this is new. And it's almost difficult to get them to stop talking because they have so much on their chest, they have so much of this out there. I mean, some of the focus groups that we conducted felt almost like this, a situation where they wanted to just let go of some of the issues that they've been carrying with them and have somebody to listen. So it's been really interesting to see, really emotional to hear all the different combinations of folks who are come up here, who have come to our sessions on a focus group basis, and also on an internet survey basis. They have a lot to say. They have a lot of comments. Rarely is it simple. Rarely is it one monolith. But they have things to say, and if you give them a chance, I think they'll actually say it.
So you mentioned folks being kind of like caught off guard when we reach out to them. Is this one of the reasons why in this project, y'all are oversampling young people of color within these communities? I know you mentioned once you get them on the phone and in discussion, they're willing to disclose and talk about the issues they're up against, what they care about, but is getting into contact with more diverse groups that haven't been engaged in this way a difficulty y'all are running across, hence the oversampling?
Absolutely right. Part of the reason we're doing the oversampling again is to make sure that we have their opinions, and again, they haven't been talked to, if at all. So it's good to hear them, have them express themselves in a way that allows them to say what they need to say. But yes, oversampling is one of the techniques that we're trying to employ, making sure we have enough to say something, not only an overarching message, but individually cut messages where we still have enough people in that sample to say something smart about it. Not just like 10 people. You can't really say anything with 10 people. But if you start to put it into the hundreds, then all of a sudden you have, well, okay, look, this seems like a good general direction or a more specific direction than kind of a broad overarching statement. What we're trying to do as well is to sample more, because we think California, especially the Central Valley, some of the Southern California districts, are extremely important and they haven't been talked to. So it's a good opportunity then to try to get as much data as we can and put it through the questionnaires that we have. So it makes it a much more standard approach, as opposed to some of the other maybe more national basis for the surveys, where their basis or the base is almost the same for a national sample that we have, let's say, for example, in one of our surveys. So it's important for us to oversample on a much larger basis this specific set of folks.
As organizers, we work a lot with younger folks, millennials and Gen Zs, because they are leading some of the most important movements right now as it pertains to climate justice, criminal justice reforms, all the policies that we care deeply about. And they are now the largest voting bloc in California and soon to be nationwide, which is super exciting and means that young people have the power to create a government that is committed to truly building the sustainable and inclusive future we all want, right? But that all depends on them staying engaged in governance. And what we saw in 2020 was 1 in 2 young folks cast a ballot. The 2021 gubernatorial recall here in California, turnout closely mirrored that. And the special elections throughout this year, turnout has been even worse. So this is really alarming going into midterm elections, because we know that the less representation there is from a voting population, the less representation we get from legislators. So Professor Garcia Bedolla, according to your findings, can you tell us a bit about what young Californians care about and how we keep them engaged in democratic life?
Thank you, Jay. So I think the really important thing to think about, so our poll was looking at 18 to 29-year-olds, and these are folks that have gone through a lot over the last few years, through most of their lives, right? So you have the Trump election and all the upheaval that came around that and governance during his presidency. You have had wildfires here in California multiple times, power shutoffs. Then we had COVID. Then we had racial unrest. Now we still have COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really that disruption, I think, is very much reflected in people's responses. And so I think the most important thing that I'm hoping folks can take home is that the current party system is not working for these young people. They feel like the ways in which the parties talk about issues, the conflict between the parties, all of that, I feel like the take home is a pox on both their houses, that neither party is seen as doing a better job, particularly in terms of climate change, which is one of the issues, not the only, but one of the issues that young people say they care very much about. There's no clear sense that the Democrats are better than the Republicans in terms of climate, or in terms of taking care of jobs, or in terms of supporting education. And so I think there's a real hunger for solutions and a real hunger for authentic leadership that is grounded in community and that cares about the things that people care about and that feels connected to the human experience. I feel like that's what we've heard more and more, is that they want leaders that seem real and that seem to have compassion, but also want to fix things, right? That they don't just want to pontificate, but they actually want to get down into the, roll their sleeves up and in fact come up with solutions to these big problems. And that there's a general dissatisfaction, I think would be the nice way of putting it, with the degree to which our governing structures are in fact addressing the very big issues that we're facing as a community. On the positive side, young people show very strong trust in and support of government. They understand that government is necessary and that it's something that matters and that voting matters. So they believe in the sort of structures of democracy, but are just very dissatisfied right now with the people who are pushing the levers within those institutions.
Yes, this is something I find extremely fascinating because, like, government gridlock, that has been all that I've ever known in terms of government. It's the world I grew up in. And as you were counting all of the different experiences we've all collectively gone through in at least the contemporary history, like, it's a lot. So I find it so fascinating that, like, we have these low turnout numbers, yet folks still believe in governance. They still believe in a government of, by, for the people. And so this research, that has been what I have found to be most surprising. Do you all share the same sentiment? Like, were you as surprised by some of these responses, or did you pretty much expect this to be the case as you were conducting this research?
I did. I wasn't surprised because, in fact, youth turnout has been going up in elections over the last, if you look across 2 decades, in fact, okay, turnout has been going up. And at least in national polls, it used to be youth talked more about wanting to do volunteer work and wanting to disassociate from government, and that has shifted a bit over time. So I wasn't completely surprised about that part. And I think some of it may be, if we don't believe in democracy, what else do we have, right? So, some of it may be sort of, this is the system we have and we have to figure out how to figure it out. But that part of increasing trust in governmental institutions seems to be a trend among young people over the last couple of decades.
Let's say, Luis, what have you found most surprising about this research?
Yeah, I'm just going to use, I guess, the takeoff on Lisa's comment. I think it has gone from more volunteer work to more assertive, politically oriented participation. So we have in between all of this, we've had a lot of racial issues with, Black Lives, with things like Black Lives Matter, who have basically brought to the fore all the things that people of color already knew, which was the difficulty with policing, difficulty with this, difficulty with that. In spite of all of these issues, though, or because of this, they have decided that, no, we're actually engaging a lot more than we have in the past. And we're engaging in a kind of a participatory as opposed to kind of symbolic, well, yes, we'll volunteer, maybe it was the past, but yes, we'll do some stuff around the edges. But it seems like people are beginning to be more like engaged in the whole process. And so they're seeing, the funny part is that we see people always responding to things like saying, "Oh, I'm not political," and like we dig and we ask a couple of questions, right? It's like, well, do you volunteer? It's like, well, yeah, I volunteer. Okay, that's not political. Well, do you get involved in protests? Well, yeah, of course I get involved in protests. And so the definition of what that means has been morphing and changing, I think, to say, oh, well, yeah, I guess I am political. I am this kind of person. So that's been interesting to see.
Yeah, that's like actually really refreshing that younger generations think that like human rights shouldn't be a political thing, right? Like it's just very much part of their identity and who they are. And yeah, that's great to hear. One of my favorite parts of doing this project with y'all are the meetings that we have, the ideation meetings where we talk about our goals, the type of information we would like to receive, the questions we want to ask, how those questions look on the screen. Can y'all speak to some of the innovative approaches you take with your polling work and some of the difficulties that are associated with trying to do research in a new way that doesn't exclude groups that have been historically excluded within this work?
So I'm going to sound like a nerd now, and I'm going to apologize for that ahead of time.
It's okay. Our members will love it.
The word is epistemology, which basically it's a big word. It sounds like a mouthful, but it's really about what do you think knowledge is, right? And what do you think is the best way to produce knowledge? And so we come to the work from the position that the best knowledge is actually co-constructed, right? That researchers can't come up with the truth, or we can never really find the truth, right? But can't get closer to the truth if they don't, in fact, benefit from the wisdom on the ground, right? And that's a very different way to do research. That is not how higher education, generally speaking, has trained researchers to go out and gather data in the community. And so it is a sea change actually within the academy. There are many people doing this kind of work. Some people call it participatory action research. Some people call it other things. But the idea is that you think that knowledge can't exist appropriately without being informed by the knowledge on the ground. So that's why we have all these meetings. And that's why we ask you guys all these questions. And it's hard, right? It's hard on both sides, right? Because both sides have to learn each other's language. Both sides have to really build trust, right? You have to trust one another, especially given the history of social scientists going and extracting information from communities of color or doing harm in communities of color through research. That history is real and I think has to be honored. But we come to it, in addition to you guys being great to have conversations with, but we come to it from the position that we learn more from you than you're learning from us, that it's not this kind of information from on high that is being sort of shared with the little people, but in fact, it is a co-constructed process. And so it is challenging also because community organizers are busy. They've got a lot going on. Sometimes they just want us to tell them what the answer is or to not have so much conversation. But we do it because in the end, we think we're coming to a better answer, right? And we're making sure that we're getting as close as possible to accurately reflecting the needs of community members who historically have not had voice. And when you're trying to represent the voices of people who haven't had the opportunity to have their voices heard, it's our ethical and moral responsibility to do our best to make sure that you're getting it right. And so that's why we take that much time and integrate the voices from the ground and triangulate. So we do quantitative surveys and then we do focus groups, because it's only through gathering different kinds of information from community that you can get closer to that accurate representation of what people think and want and believe.
I'll tell you, the feeling is mutual, because when we come out of those conversations, we're always like, we learned so much from these meetings, and obviously the research then guides our work. Diving in a little bit to that, organizers are really busy, and because our schedules move really fast, news cycles move really fast, people's attention moves really fast, there's often this feeling that we have to move, and it's less long-term in terms of our strategy and our goals. So could you share how you think organizers should be using this type of information, polls, academic research within our work?
I'm hesitant to say should, but I do think for organizing, for us to build power the way that we need to build power in order to actually change politics in the United States, and to change the day-to-day well-being of all of our communities, we have to do both. We have to be nimble and quick and be able to address the short-term needs. And we have to open up space to be able to think and plan and plot and have a longer time horizon to be able to move things over time. And I think the challenge in organizing is because most organizations are working on shoestring budgets, don't have enough staff, have much more work to do than they can possibly accomplish. Folks get really caught up in kind of the hamster wheel of the moment and don't have the space that I think as a movement we need in order to really think about the big picture and situate work. And I think that space to think about the big picture also helps people not burn out, right? Because being caught in that day-to-day can feel very exhausting. And so I think I think the way to sustain movement is to have both. And that what I hope to bring and what we hope to bring as researchers is a little bit of capacity to give you that space that we take an hour of kind of brainstorming, and then we can go off and do the work and put that together and bring it back to you so you don't have to. And that's where I think researchers can be of value to movement builders is to give you the data capacity, research capacity to be able to kind of take that step back, look at the big picture and think about 5 and 10-year time horizons, because that's so difficult the way that the nonprofit sector is currently structured, the way that we do funding, everything about it speaks to short-term, kind of instrumental work rather than long-term strategic planning.
Just to piggyback on what Lisa just said about capacity building, one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to not only provide the capacity, but over time, provide organizations the tools, the knowledge base, all that kind of stuff, so that eventually, we can see ourselves out of business. It would be great to be able to have these people of color organizations take on the mantle and say, you know what, I know how to data crunch, I know how to do this, I know how to do that, because back in the day, this little organization, built that capacity. And so that's our goal. Our goal is to be able to give people the tools to organize on their own, to do all the data stuff that they need to do on their own, so that we can then just come in and say, okay, well, now that you've built your own surveys, now that you've done all this stuff on your own, here's what the next gen or next level advice that we can provide you. All that stuff, a lot of people tend to build that as kind of secret knowledge or special sauce, when in fact, some of that is fairly easily to do. It just takes time and practice and what have you. Yes, we have the benefit of Dr. Garcia Bedolla to be able to do this on a regular basis and to say, oh yeah, do it this way. But over time, the people on the ground are going to have to be the experts. They're going to have to be the ones that carry the ball forward. The next generation has to move things forward. So that's kind of our approach to things. And I think it's a little bit different than most folks.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And honestly, this conversation is kind of in real time refreshing me, because I'll admit, when I get burnt out, I don't look to the future. I tend to look at the past. And one thing I do is I read a lot of, history books, because I'm like thinking, oh, if we've been there and gotten here, it will get better. There is something to keep showing up for and working towards. And I often stop there at the present and don't, think about the long-term future. So I really appreciate this approach in terms of how we should use research in order to plan for those longer term goals, but also use it as a way to sustain our work, so we're not caught into this, let's get it done and let's get it done now mindset, because it is incredibly exhausting when you operate from that perspective. So I appreciate that. And I hope, Jose Luis, one day we'll get there and y'all, not like in a bad way, will be out of business because we're good. So I'd like to touch upon one more topic before we wrap up, and that's representation in academia and research. Representation matters. It matters in so many ways. And one of the areas in research has to do with assumptions made. I learned this while taking an economics of discrimination research seminar in my last semester of my undergrad. I remember being so excited to dive into the vast area of research and learn about how discrimination impacts economic systems. But I quickly learned in that seminar that so much of the research that had been done up to this point doesn't hold up in the real world. One of the most important lessons I learned in my undergrad is that research done on diverse groups by people who don't identify with those groups often breaks down in the real world because of inaccurate assumptions made in the research process. And to this day, we still have an underrepresentation of people of color doing this critical work, the work y'all are doing, which means research still isn't relevant to enough people. So, Professor, my question to you is, can you speak to why it's important to have people of color doing this critical work? I know you touched upon it on the top, but I was hoping we could dive more into this to get folks inspired to actually see themselves having a career in this type of work.
Yes, who produces knowledge matters, right? And it doesn't have to be malicious intent. I just saw a call for papers for a journal on the racism of omission, right? We tend to talk about racism as somehow a conscious act or something someone does, instead of saying the silences are just as important. One of the most common responses I had as a graduate student when I would say things in seminars was silence, right? Silence is very powerful. What we don't talk about, the questions we don't ask, the people we don't talk to, all of that really matters. And so that's why, for me, that's been a driving force of what has kept me in the academy. It's one of the reasons I'm so excited to be Vice Provost for Graduate Studies at Berkeley, is because it is now my obligation to make sure that we get more diverse voices into our graduate programs and get them through those graduate programs and make sure that they can ask those questions and have that voice and not experience those silences like I did. And so I think we underappreciate the importance of having knowledge produced by people with different kinds of life experiences. Because if you're in a lab full of people who've all seen the world in exactly the same way and lived the same things, chances are there are questions, important questions, that they're just not thinking to ask. Again, not out of malicious intent, but simply because it just doesn't come to mind, because it's not part of their lived experience, or it's just not something that would occur to them. And so that's why diversity matters, right? Is that we all have different kinds of brains. We bring a different set of experiences, cultures, capacities, languages, sensitivities, and sensibilities that are all part of our lived experience. And it's only through bringing together that very diverse set of experiences that we can possibly imagine building the knowledge we need to solve the big problems that American society and the world are facing right now.
So, Professor, one last question for you. What can we be doing to encourage more people of color to get involved with this work?
It's a really good question that I've been trying to answer for the last 25 years. I think, so an answer, I often get the question, why do I study voting? And because voting doesn't matter. And the answer I give is, if voting didn't matter, folks wouldn't have spent so much time and energy over the course of American history making sure that you can't do it. So that's number one. If it didn't have an impact, there would be no need for disenfranchisement. There would be no need for registration, all the hurdles that we put in the place of voting. But beyond voting, I think I'm hoping what people will get out of COVID is that we are all in community together, and that we have some really big problems in terms of public health and the climate and other things that are affecting us all, regardless of our neighborhood, income, racial background, whatever. And that it's only through our collective engagement with the process that we can imagine coming to a solution to those problems. And that, are our institutions perfect? Absolutely not. Do our elected officials always do what they're supposed to? Absolutely not. But this is the system we've got. And in fact, what the system has done is it's trained people to think they can't actually access it and influence it when we can. And so figure out what it is that you're passionate about, whatever that may be, and go for it, and try to figure out who's responsible for it. And in fact, the place you're most likely to have an impact is the place we never talk about, which is your local government, right? So your city council person, your school board, if you care about having that stop sign at that corner where kids almost get run over, figure out who's in charge of that and make it happen. Or if it's about the lunches in your schools being lousy, figure out who is in charge of that and make it happen. And I think we need to just remember that, in fact, we have the ability to access our institutions much more than we're taught. And the reason we're not taught it is because the people running those institutions don't want us to access them. And so start with something that you care a lot about, and you'll be surprised to learn that, in fact, you have a lot more power than you think.
Jose Luis, would you like to add anything?
Well, that's kind of hard to follow, but no, I think it's true. I mean, I'm going to go back to kind of my early organizing experience, where I used to run campaigns when I was fresh out of college, fresh out of Berkeley. And it will always surprise me that, at least with the Latino candidates, they always had a strong core of women. I'm going to say that again. They always had a strong core of women. And I kind of scratched my head and, thought about it for years. And, asked some of the folks that had been involved and said, well, look, at the end of the day, it's the abuelita network. It's the grandparents. It's the amount of knowledge that's in the community already. Going back to a couple of comments ago, there is so much knowledge, so much information that is there to organize. There's a natural organizational capacity that is there in the community itself, that knowledge base that's there, that if there is a goal, if there is someone to say, look, okay, we need to take that hill, or hey guys, let's figure out how to take that hill, they'll go for it and do it. They'll put in the stop, change the lunches. I see an infinite amount of power and energy when people come together. And I think that voting is just one of the culmination, or maybe the culmination piece of all of this effort. And we need to continue to tell people why it is. Going back to what Professor Garcia Bedolla said about, the reason why it's important, the reason why it's there is to make sure that you can change things over time in the system that we've got. In the most peaceful way, I'm going to say that again, the most peaceful way possible to transfer power from one group to another group. And so we're at that point, we're at the tipping point where a lot of the power is going to be transferred to, guess what? People like us, people of color. And so that's why we want to make sure it's a peaceful transition to get to that point. That's it, no bones about it.
Great. I love that you mentioned abuelas, because my abuela is one of the reasons why, if not the main reason why I do this work. She was, I like to say, the OG organizer of our family. She would work 3 jobs, but also on top of working those 3 jobs, would cook meals for the community, would, take clothes from one place to another place to make sure the community was housed. And it wasn't until later in life, when my grandmother wasn't well, that I realized how much of an impact she had on our community, because I would be pushing her wheelchair through a grocery store and all of these folks would come up to us. And I'm just like, wow, it was a source of inspiration that I still hold very near and dear to this day. And it keeps me going.
And I'm sure they would say this is not political, but it is.
Yes, exactly.
This is not organizing, but it is. All that kind of stuff. And, it's almost of like allowing ourselves the space, allowing folks the space to say, yeah, we can do this and it's okay. And, it's not a bad thing to be quote unquote political. It's not a bad thing to demand. It's not a bad thing to ask. And I think that that's the part that sometimes, folks just don't have that background or that training to say, of course, this should be ours. This should be something that we want to do. But anyway.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. But before we wrap up, Professor Garcia Bedolla and Jose Luis, can you let our listeners know where they can access your work?
So if you just go to dataforsocialgood.org, that's our website, and you can see the reports that we've written and the research that we've done. And then also on the Courage website
yes,
is our youth poll. And I did want to say that part of the reason we want this to be an ongoing poll is, again, to get out of that electoral cycle mania and to just have an ongoing conversation with the youth of California and lift up the issues that they care about, irrespective of what's hot in a particular election.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for taking an hour out of your day to join me for this conversation. I really appreciate the time, and also it was incredibly insightful and inspirational. So thank you for this.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Jay, for conducting today's interview. I wish we were able to spend so much more time on this subject. Hopefully we can do a part 2 in the future. What do you all think? I don't know. I'll do a poll. But this conversation doesn't have to end here. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Drop a line and join the conversation. Tag us at CourageCA or by using the hashtag #CourageLooksGoodOnYou. And now, your shot of courage. All registered voters in California will receive a vote-by-mail ballot for the June 7th primary election. The last day to register to vote is May 23rd. Your county elections office will begin mailing ballots by May 9th. If it feels like California has had a lot of elections lately, that's probably because California has had a lot of elections lately. This is why I invited Courage California's Executive Director, Irene to join us today to speak about the June 7th primary election. Irene, thank you for joining us. It's exciting to have you here. A little shot of Courage exclusive.
Hi, Angela. I'm really excited to be talking to you about this election.
So, Irene, I want to start off this conversation acknowledging a term that you and I have been all too familiar with lately, and that is election fatigue. Californians were literally just asked to show up to the polls months ago, and now we're being asked to show up again. So, knowing all the different spaces that you're in with partners, different electoral spaces, and also with polling, such as what we just heard, I'm curious as to what you're hearing about the upcoming California primary election on June 7th. And I'm also curious to hear from you about why it is so important for Californians to show up and what we could be doing better to prepare and energize voters around the upcoming election.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I'm not hearing enough about the June 7th primary election. That is what worries me. So I know a lot of our partners are paying attention to it. Certainly, candidates are pushing us for endorsements and wanting folks like us to weigh in on their races so that they can get a head start on their campaigns. But we are, just a few weeks out from when ballots go out, and the radio silence around this election really worries me because, as you mentioned, there are some things that are going to be on the ballot that will be decided this June 7th. So I think a lot of folks are in the mentality of general election time, so thinking November is when it will be really important to turn out. I don't think most people know or are really engaged around the fact that, especially around local elections, both in terms of candidates and ballot measures, June 7th is the day when those decisions will be made. So in a couple cases on local races where there are just two candidates running, if one candidate gets the majority of the votes, that person can just win outright. So there's a couple local district attorney races, like in Sacramento, where there's only two candidates, Alana Matthews and Tian Ho, and that will likely be decided June 7th. And that's really a huge leadership role in such a significant county as Sacramento County. But again, I'm not sure how many people are paying attention to that. So what I'm really hoping is that in the next month, Courage and our other partners, candidates, the parties, anyone who's involved in elections, and people who aren't even involved in elections, but people who feel like they have a stake in how decisions are made around public safety, around housing, any top issue that people are thinking about, feel like this election has something at stake for them and that it's important to turn out and not wait until November. And then on top of that, in a couple of races, June 7th really determines who the top two candidates are that we're going to vote on in December in statewide races. And that's really important too, because in some races, there could be candidates split the vote and we end up with a Democrat versus Republican or Democrat versus Democrat. And that has really big consequences too about the choices that people have in November. So June 7th, really important for people to get out. And I'm also really excited too, because I think, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of fatigue between the recall. I think also some of our campaigns to try to push Congress to pass bills and those being largely unsuccessful. Also wanting people to remember there are very concrete things that you can do and get passed here at the local level that don't depend on Congress, that depend on your state legislature, your local district attorney, your local sheriff. Those are all races that can, again, be determined or really set June 7th.
You mentioned a couple of local races that will be on California's ballots on June 7th. Why are these local races so important? And what should voters know about them? And where can people go for more information to ensure that they're making informed decisions on these maybe lesser known or less publicized races?
So like you mentioned, local races and local leadership does not give the same attention as federal leadership. So ask any voter, and they probably have a pretty good sense of what big bills are in front of Congress and where people are at on that. But when it actually comes to the bills and the decisions that actually impact our day-to-day lives more, that's going to come more from the local and statewide level. And on top of that, because these are offices and leadership who are serving a more local base, these are folks that you are more likely to have success doing ongoing lobbying and advocacy work with. They're likely to be more responsive to you and what you want, as opposed to trying to reach members of Congress or members of the Senate or the presidential office. So I would say probably the easiest example to look at this through is sort of considering what's happening right now in San Francisco with the Chesa Boudin recall, right? Interestingly enough, there's been a lot of weight put on that race. So all of a sudden, DA Chesa Boudin, who is part of this much larger criminal justice system, is all of a sudden being seen as the one person who's setting the tone for public safety in the city and county, even though obviously law enforcement plays a really large role in that, and other leadership in San Francisco does too. So we want to give the right weight of importance to somebody like a district attorney, but also don't want to also give them outsized influence or burden on that too, because obviously other local elected officials weigh in on that as well too. So in the case of Chase, I think that's also a really good example of how folks can sort of look for what are the types of information and who do you really look for to figure out how to vote on issues like that. So the Chesa recall is a really big hot button issue, very controversial. For us at Courage, I would say there's a couple ways that we look at races, especially in our Courage voter guide. So that as a really key resource for folks, because we unpack sort of the dynamics in the race. And for us, what's really important is looking especially at the funding sources. So who's giving money to these campaigns for and against? Where are they coming from, both in terms of geography, but also the history of giving? So in terms of the Prop H, the Chesa recall, a lot of the money coming in to support his recall is coming from outside of San Francisco and outside of California. And it's coming from donors who give to other right-wing causes. We're also seeing some contributions coming in from tech executives who have had cases in front of Chesa. So Chesa's been trying to hold companies like DoorDash accountable for how they treat their workers, how they categorize their workers. And there's no coincidence that these are the same tech executives who are now giving in support of the recall campaign. And even though they say that they're trying to do this for public safety, if we had seen these same tech executives, these same supporters give in support of public safety in terms of solutions that we know that work, like diversion programs, community programs and support, then it would be easier to understand, oh, this is a pattern of giving, or the donors really care about this. But the fact that they're only giving to the Chesa campaign or giving to the Chesa recall and not investing in communities, to me, that's a great indication that this is a political motivation. They're just trying to get out a leader who's willing to hold them accountable and to go after them. So that's one I would say, following misinformation and trying to really understand where specific messaging and narratives are coming from. So obviously the Chesa recall has a lot of money, again, from these same sorts of donors. And so they're able to message a particular way. But when you start to look into what they're mentioning, again, they're sort of letting the San Francisco Police Department off the hook in terms of their responsibility, in terms of holding people accountable and actually giving people closure, providing services to survivors. There's a lot of holes and gaps in their messaging that they're all trying to attribute to Chesa, but is really about the whole system. And so that's another one. And I think another is for us with the Courage Voter Guide, we partner a lot with other organizations who do year-round work on the ground, working in communities, to get their sense of how is this candidate serving you? How are they not? How are these other forces opposing you and not? And in the case, again, of the recall, working with people like San Francisco Rising Action, who have been working with Chesa from his original campaign and then since day one, since he was in office, and trusting their judgment on working with Chesa, but also, they've been working deeply in communities of color, in particular in San Francisco, for years. So they know specifically what these communities want, what they aren't getting from the existing criminal justice system. And so really following their lead and making sure that people understand and listen to them when it comes to understanding the dynamics of the race and how to vote.
I'm hearing a couple of important things from you right now. One being campaign funding. The funding sources for campaigns, such as the San Francisco DA recall you mentioned, is incredibly strategic. Prop H is all about funding and has very little to do with truth. All you have to do is look at, one, who's funding the recall election, and two, look at the actual stats and figures of the district attorney's office in San Francisco. They're actually doing a great job, but you wouldn't know that if you just look at the ads or listen to the ads on the radio that the Prop H campaign is paying for. And unfortunately, they have a lot of money to pay for ads and really manipulate the system for their benefit while rejecting the will of the voters. And two, I'm hearing that there will be other races on the June 7th ballot that will also have an effect on criminal justice and public safety in our communities. Aside from the long list of DA races, sheriffs and judges are also elected positions that we, the people, have a say in. It is up to us to show up to the polls every opportunity we get, because if we don't, that gives funders the green light to decide these elections for us. They will never not show up. And unfortunately, it sounds like a lot of Californians may not even be aware that they will be receiving a ballot in a matter of days. So it is really important that we do our best to spread the word that California's primaries are coming, and it is important. What you've shared so far about the DA races, it is clear that public safety will be on the ballot this June 7th. But I'm wondering, what are some examples of other races that people will be asked to vote on that also affect public safety?
Yeah, so the local races I'm also thinking about are city council races, board of supervisor races. These are people who, again, set policies for cities and counties. And in the board of supervisors case, these are people who are setting some pretty significant budgets for their counties as well. In the case of Los Angeles County, for instance, their countywide budget is larger than several states in the United States. And so when we're talking about the need for more investments in housing to address sort of the problem with too many people being unhoused and sort of falling through the safety net right now, that depends largely a lot on these sort of local races, again, where they're setting the budgets and setting these policies. In terms of public safety, we know that public safety is much more holistic beyond the criminal justice system. Public safety is about housing, it's about food security, it's about economic security. And so again, when you're talking about these local electeds who can set the budget and determine how much money goes into each of these buckets, that becomes, for me, a very significant way to influence how your city or your county is investing in what we know works and what we know needs more investments in order for our communities to be a lot safer, and safer in the more holistic sense too. And I think also what's really important is looking at these two is, in some of these cases, you have a city council or a board of supervisors where oftentimes, because people aren't paying attention to these elections, these governing bodies are often not very representative of the population as it is now. So as people have been, and I would especially call it our local partners, have been investing in and paying attention to these races, they've been able to help get more city council members, board of supervisors who are a lot more representative of the diversity within our communities and a lot more politically aligned with our communities. And so that's been really important in changing the dynamics at a very, again, real day-to-day level for people. Again, like people may not be going to those meetings, may not be paying attention to all those elections all the time. I hope that people really focus on those, because again, not only can some of those races be determined June 7th, but these are actually some of the races that will have much deeper and bigger consequences for how things look in our daily lives right now.
I am so glad you mentioned budgets. This reminds me of a recent news article I came across about California cities spending huge amounts of federal COVID relief funds on their police departments. So instead of giving stimulus money to health, housing, and food programs, a great deal of funds went into law enforcement. And this is COVID relief funds. And my assumption is that residents had little to no knowledge that this was happening. And this is such a great example of how impactful all elections are, from primary to local elections. Voters may not have had knowledge that this was happening, but they did vote for their council members. They had already voted for the people who make budgetary decisions. They had already put them in office in that role. So my final question for you, Irene, is what can people start doing now to prepare for the June 7th California primary elections?
Yeah, I would say to start doing research. So even though your ballots may not be out there, every county registrar has a list what races and ballot measures are going to appear on your ballot. The most important thing is just sort of do a little bit of research to figure out what's going to be on your ballot and determine where you're going to find the information to figure out how to vote on each of those pieces of it. So with the Courage Voter Guide, we will cover all the congressional races, all the state legislative races, and we'll cover some local races and ballot measures as well. So that is definitely a resource. But a lot of local groups and organizations also do the same thing. And they're oftentimes local media and publications will put out their own endorsements as well. So just trying to find the resources that people trust to make sure that they have the information there. So I say that's most of it. I think some of it too is also just starting to talk with friends and family about this election. I think what I'm most worried about is thinking about how much money the oil and gas industry is already putting into this into this election, into races up and down the ballot. So industry already knows that there's a lot at stake. And so they are counting on being able to turn out voters in their favor based on ads and in favor of their candidates. And so communities really need to be an effective counterweight to that, which is, again, try to get as many people as you can to show up and just be aware that there's an election and share information and resources that you have with friends and family that this is coming. So just heard from Lindsay on our team that he just received his voter booklet for Los Angeles County. And so, that is probably the first time most people are even getting information that there's an election at all happening on June 7th. So just getting people excited about it, just more aware of it and sharing that information. And again, just doing a little bit of research. There is a lot of information out there already. And it's just good because now with a head start, people can feel like they're not having to make a decision right when their ballot's in front of them. But the beauty of having mail-in ballots now is, you have your ballot for a while. So you can have it there in front of you and do your research with you and not feel like you have to just make that decision just right when you step into that voting booth. So I'm hoping people take advantage of that to, again, just vote with the information that they have and are able to find information that they both trust and find is aligned with their values. And every registered voter will receive a mail-in ballot. Voter registration also goes until May 23rd, so pretty close to the June 7th election date. So folks who are not registered now still have time to register. And if you're not able to register in time for a mail-in ballot, there's always going to be other voting options. And so encourage folks to check out our CourageCaliforniaInstitute.org website that has county by county information about how people can vote in many different ways.
Thank you so much, Irene, for joining us today on Shot of Courage and just sharing all of your insights and knowledge on the upcoming elections. It is always great chatting with you, and it's very exciting to be able to share it now with our listeners. So thank you again for joining us. And for all of our listeners, I just want to remind you all that you can access our Courage California resources by visiting couragecalifornia.org. From there, you can find our Courage California voter guide, and you'll be able to visit our CourageCaliforniaInstitute.org website, which is our C3 voter educational and resource website. When you visit Courage California Institute, you'll be able to register to vote, track your ballot, find voter information county by county, and find all the important dates specific to your county. So it really does have a great deal of voter education and research. So take a look at our sites, our resources, keep a lookout for your ballot. Ballots come out after May 9th, and then have a voting plan. Tell your friend about your voting plan. Maybe have your voting plan include bringing a friend. Maybe text 5 friends. Maybe give all of them a ride. Carpool, a voting carpool. Yes, let's do it. I'm sold. And thank you again to Irene Gao, Executive Director at Courage California, for joining us today at A Shot of Courage.
Thank you, Angela.
Visit couragevoterguide.org to learn who the candidates are in your area and which candidates Courage California has endorsed. Candidates who we identify as progressive champions who will work closely with our communities to strive for equity, justice, and accountability. It is important that Californians vote for leaders who will vote in the interests of our communities. Thank you so much for sticking with us today and for joining our second episode. I'm your host, Angela Chavez, and this has been Courage. It looks good on you. And if you like this podcast, please rate it and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. And of course, share.